Chapter 9, Skeletal Muscle, Tissue, and Muscle Organization. We've got over 700 muscles, skeletal muscles in our body, and fortunately we'll be learning far fewer than that, but there's a lot of muscles. Muscles are technically organs because they do contain all four tissue types. Obviously, they have muscle tissue, but they'll also have connective tissue, as we see. They have epithelial tissue lining their blood vessels, and then nervous tissue because our skeletal muscles are innervated, which gives us conscious control of our skeletal muscles. In this chapter, we'll focus on how a muscle is physically organized and how muscles cause movement of the body. And we'll focus on skeletal muscle, not smooth muscle, in this chapter. So muscle types: skeletal muscle attaches to and moves our skeleton, provides movement through the body, and it's voluntary and striated in the sense that when you look at it on a histological slide, you'll see these little lines, these striations, and we'll talk about why the skeletal muscle is striated. Cardiac muscle, another type of muscle, is found in the walls of our heart to have our hearts be a nice efficient pump. Cardiac muscle is involuntary in the sense that the cardiac muscle contracts on its own, which is convenient so you don't have to think about keeping your heart beating. And just like skeletal muscle, it is also striated in appearance. And then smooth muscle is referred to as smooth because there are no striations in the muscle cells or fibers. And we find smooth muscles through our GI tract, our gastrointestinal tract or gut, within our urinary tract, within our blood vessels. And just like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle is involuntary, contracts without our conscious effort or control, which is good because then you don't have to think about moving food through your gut, moving urine through most of the urinary tract, or causing our blood vessels to contract or dilate. So let's move at some of the characteristics of muscles, focusing again on skeletal muscle. So skeletal cells are referred to as fibers because they're very elongated. So if you say, or if I say muscle cell or muscle fiber, those terms are interchangeable. Some of the properties: they have excitability or responsiveness. They respond to electrical excitation. And in terms of contraction, that's going to be an action potential. And when a muscle is stimulated by an action potential, it contracts. So skeletal fibers and skeletal tissue have contractility. They shorten when stimulating, and the entire muscle will shorten, and that causes movement. Because when the muscle shortens, and it being attached to our skeletal system, bones, the muscle pulls on the bone at the joint that behaves as a lever or lever, and then that causes contraction, movement at that particular joint. Muscles also can be stretched. Cells, muscle fibers can also be stretched, so they have extensibility. They can stretch up to 3 times their contracted length. And this hopefully will make sense in the sense that muscles usually work in opposition to each other. So muscles on opposite sides of the body or body structure contract on one side and relax on the other side. And the relaxed muscle gets pulled or extended. So in the example here of flexing at the elbow, your anterior muscles at the arm, like your biceps brachii or brachialis, will contract, causing flexion at the elbow, and the muscles on the opposite side, triceps brachii, get pulled or extended for contraction. If we're going to extend the elbow, now the triceps brachii contracts and shortens, and the biceps brachii will get extended and pulled in length somewhat. They have elasticity. After a muscle is stretched, it will somewhat recoil to its original length, kind of like a rubber band. And that's due to the connective tissue that is found within muscle fibers and muscles themselves, as we'll see. Here's the concept of muscles working in opposition to each other on opposite sides of the body, opposite sides of structures, so that if one muscle contracts, the other muscle extends on the opposite side. When the roles are reversed and the muscle on the back side of the arm, for example, the triceps brachii contracts, then the biceps brachii will get pulled, extended. Again, the contraction causes movement at a joint. In this example here, flexion at the elbow, and then over here, extension at the elbow. And this is possible, or this occurs this way, because muscles can't push. They can only pull by contracting. So overall functions, skeletal muscles are voluntary, so they move our skeleton and cause us to move or allow us to manipulate things in the environment. And they're usually attached to one or more bones. So they cause movement of the body and inside of the body. For example, swallowing, the initial phases of swallowing are achieved through the contraction of skeletal muscles in the mouth and in the upper portions of the throat or esophagus. Muscles give us posture. Stability helps us maintain posture if you're standing upright or sitting upright, and helps prevent unwanted movements. Support. Sheets of muscles, for example, that line our abdominal cavity, support our internal organs or visceral organs or viscera. Entry and exit of materials. So control of body openings and passages via orifices or sphincters, movement of blood and food. So I mentioned skeletal muscles operate to do the initial swallowing. After that, smooth muscles take over to move food through the digestive tract. At the very end, we use skeletal muscles to control defecation. Movement of blood, the cardiac musculature of the heart pumps blood. Blood vessels have smooth muscles to allow them to dilate and constrict. Temperature regulation. So when muscles contract, they produce metabolic heat. And that is what provides most of our body heat, allowing us to thermoregulate. If you use your skeletal muscles a lot or excessively, they generate enough heat that your body temperature rises, and we have mechanisms to deal with that. For example, sweating, and also the blood vessels near the surface of the skin will vasodilate, open up, allowing the hot blood to get closer to the surface of the skin and radiate away heat. So looking at the gross anatomy of a muscle, so what we have here in the diagram is we're looking at one muscle, zooming into one muscle, and it's cut in cross section here, and its attachment to the bone via a tendon. If you remember, dense regular connective tissue. So let's look at the connective tissue components of a muscle. And remember, a muscle is an organ. Excuse me. Surrounding the entire muscle is the epimysium, epi for on top of, mys for muscle. So if we zoom in here, or if we look here, sorry, the epimysium is on the surface of the muscle. In cross section, here is the outer edge of the muscle, and it's covered by a connective tissue sheath called the epimysium. Helps bind the muscle, hold it intact. Internally, the perimysium surrounds each muscle fascicle. So if we look inside, there's these round oval type compartments within a muscle, and these things are called fascicles. And what a fascicle is, here's one of them. This thing is one of these fascicles. So multiple fascicles within a muscle. Looking at just one fascicle, it is surrounded by its own separate connective tissue sheath called the perimysium. And then within each fascicle, there are individual muscle fibers. Remember, a muscle fiber is just a muscle cell. So this fascicle has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 muscle fibers in cross-section. And if we look at just one muscle fiber right here, it itself is surrounded by connective tissue called the endomysium, for inside of. Endomysium surrounds each muscle fiber. So these connective tissue sheaths or envelopments are throughout the muscle, and at the ends of the muscle, they all merge together at the attachment to the bone, in this case, the tendon. The deep fascia covers the epimysium, and that's not shown here, but it would be connective tissue that surrounds the epimysium. And the function of this is to separate neighboring muscles or muscle groups, kind of packaging for muscle groups in a way, making compartments. So for example, we have the anterior and posterior compartment in our arm and in our leg. And then moving outward towards the skin, we have the superficial fascia, also called the subcutaneous fascia, and then also called the hypodermis. And that you should ring a bell from when we looked at the integument, the skin. So the hypodermis, remember a lot of adipose tissue there, that separates the muscle, which is deep, from the skin, which is superficial. Excuse me. And I think I showed you this before, this picture of some superficial fascia underlining the skin, which has been removed. If you remove this, you'll see muscle, which is in brown here, and the muscle is kind of enveloped in a connective tissue sheath also, and that would be the deep fascia. So a tendon or an aponeurosis, a tendon is the connective tissue binding between a muscle and the bone. So all of the three connective tissue components, epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium, all merge together and form the tendon, very strong attachment to the bone. An aponeurosis is a broad sheet-like tendon. We have one on the top of our head called the epicranial aponeurosis, on top of the cranium aponeurosis. And it's a flat sheet-like tendon that attaches what's usually called the frontalis and the occipitalis. Here it's also called the frontal belly of the occipital frontalis, and that aponeurosis attaches that to the occipital belly of the occipital frontalis. So this is kind of considered one muscle, the occipital frontalis. For clarity or simplicity, we can call this the frontalis, and then this one the occipitalis. And in lab and for lecture, you just need to know this one. And we'll just call it the frontalis. So innervation and blood vessels lie within the connective tissue layers of the muscle, because the innervation has to reach all the way down into the individual muscle fibers, and those are living cells, and they also need their blood vessels, blood supply. So, let's all pop that at once. So the innervation. So nerves branch into individual motor neurons, individual cells, neurons, and their extensions, their axons, extend into the muscles, and they terminate at the axon terminals, or terminal boutons, another term for it. And those axon terminals touch essentially the muscles, fibers, at what's called the neuromuscular junction, right, for neuron and for muscle. At the neuromuscular junction, the axon terminals plus what's called the motor end plate, and that's a modified sarcolemma, and that's the special name, here we go, sarcolemma, for the muscle fiber plasma membrane. And that's the motor end plate. Okay, so the modified fiber plasma membrane. So these two things form the neuromuscular junction. That's the neural part, and that's the muscular part. Okay? And then what gets released at the neuromuscular junction, the axon terminals, is acetylcholine, which stimulates the muscle to contract.